next talk. This is going to be Tom, and he's going to be talking about stories through logging. So I will give it away to Tom, and have fun, you guys.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? That's good. You might regret that later, but we'll say it's okay for now. So welcome. It's great to be here and have an opportunity to talk to you about logging, which is potentially the most boring thing that anyone will talk to you about at this conference, but I'm going to try my best to make this actually exciting. As kind of the impetus for me writing this talk was the partner at our company, Hurricane Labs, told me, hey, Tom, you do a great job giving talks, and please start talking about things we actually do. So we do a lot of log management work, and full disclosure, we're a company that sells Splunk, and I'm going to try my best to not say the word Splunk anymore in this conversation. The concepts I'm going to talk about are going to be universally applicable to whatever sort of log management you do. I encourage you to ask any questions that you might have in this presentation. I want to make this a dialogue. I want to make this a conversation. As for myself, I am from Cleveland, and I work there. And I know Cleveland and Detroit, we kind of are in a similar boat in a lot of cases, where talented people aren't necessarily staying where they grow up. So I'm happy to be where I grew up, and I know a lot of you are probably doing the same for Detroit. I do have to say that you guys have a very innovative approach to keeping people in Detroit, closing all of I-75 southbound. Seems like a great way to accomplish that. So I'm not really sure. I might actually be spending the next 2 years in Detroit because I won't be able to figure out how to get home tonight. So on that note, let's start with the story. And conveniently enough, I have a slide about that. So let's set the scene here. So we have a global financial services organization that is running a e-commerce site that everyone uses to conduct their business. We can think of it for the sake of this example, and this is all based on a true story, but I'm changing the names and facts to protect the innocent that may or may not be current customers. So I don't think any one of them are in the room, so I don't feel bad. So this global financial services company has an e-commerce site. All of their business goes through it, and it's critical that this site is running and functioning in order for them to basically conduct their business. They have customers around the world, and they really, if the site isn't working, they have problems. Well, of course, April 7th, 2017 rolls around, and there is May Day. Lots of bad things are happening, and the website is not available. The e-commerce site is crawling. You're getting all kinds of errors that are popping up that people aren't expecting. The web servers are crashing. As you can see, when a web server crashes, it splits in half in the rack, and that's not good. The business is impacted. There are lots of charts on presentations and people with suits offices that have lines going down, and I don't know what that means, but it's bad. And when it's red, it's even more bad. So obviously, not good, because the graph says it's not good. So right now, what are you thinking? When you have this situation, you have a website, people need to go to it, your business is impacted, the people who are writing your paychecks aren't going to write your paychecks until this is solved. What are you thinking? I heard something. Fix it. Yeah, that's a good one. Fix it. What might be causing something like this? Very true. He said Windows, If they're running all of their servers on IIS 5.0, they might have some bigger problems than talking about logging. But yes, if it's Windows, that could be part of the problem. What else could be causing this problem? I owe you afterwards to get to this slide, so thank you very much. Denial of service attack, of course. This could be what's happening. What other questions do you have when you're confronted with something like this? What are going through your mind as a security professional or an IT analyst? There's got to be something going through someone's mind.
Are there any open or exposed ports?
Yeah, sure. Are there any open or exposed ports? How are people getting in? Obviously, if you're running a website, people have to get to it somehow. So there's something that's exposed.
Any recent changes?
I'll give you a prize later, too. So yes, what changed? So inevitably, people are thinking, and nothing changed except, of course, the firewall. Yeah. Well, you look at this from the perspective of, this is based on a true story, where I performed a firewall upgrade for a client, and like 2 days later, they had something that looked very much like a denial of service attack, where their website was crashing, where their service was unavailable, where the customer was quite irritated with me because of this firewall update. And literally a quote that I got from this client was, hey, we didn't have this problem on the old firewall. Like, well, guys, that's not how it works. You don't upgrade a firewall and then a denial of service attack happens because of the firewall. But how do I explain that to someone? Because from the perspective of a business person, everything was working, change firewall, denial of service attack. Clearly, firewall causes denial of service attack by being upgraded. So it was my job to demonstrate, to figure out what is happening and to solve that problem. And how do I do that? With logs. So let's take a step back. And conveniently, our log graphic will be doing that for us. So this is when I actually get to the title of the slide, or the title of the presentation. It was the best of logs. It was the worst of logs. I always thought this was a great way for me to justify all the Shakespeare I learned in high school. I'm not still in high school, as though people ask me. As recently as yesterday, when I went to a client, they asked me if I was there for my senior capstone. I'm like, no, I'm a consultant, sorry. And that's exactly what I was going to say. Someone told me that is Charles Dickens and not Shakespeare. I'm like, well, I really am glad I'm in IT and not an English major. So yeah, that was a joke. I make a lot of bad ones throughout this presentation. But if you laugh and if we all laugh together, it'll make it go easier, and then you can have lunch afterwards. So a lot of times when I look at, as you said, Windows admins, they have this look. What logs? Like, we have logs of things, really? That's cool. And actually, it kind of was like something that I posted on Twitter. Hey, I'm not sure this log file is still being written to. tail-f. It's Windows. Install Linux, then run tail-f. So, exactly. A lot of Windows admins, and I'm not trying to badmouth anyone, I sort of am, but you don't necessarily realize that logs exist. And really, we talk about logging, it's this thing that people don't really consider until we need it. But fundamentally, logs are useful. They tell the story of what's happening. So you get a log that says, hey, server's walking, server's walking, server's walking, server's walking, server's walking, server's walking. And that seems as boring as hell, which it fundamentally is. And most of the time, you're not going to be reading a log like that until you need it. However, when you need it, that server is walking, the server is tripped and fell on its face. Here's the reason why. That becomes really useful to have. And it can tell you exactly why the server tripped. And in fact, if we were logging, the conditions of the pavement that the server was walking on, like say there was sensors on his feet, we could say, oh, there was a crack in the ground, or there's a pothole, or they just demolished the bridge on I-75 and he fell into the river. Any of those things could have happened. So inevitably you're asking at this point, hey Tom, where do logs come? Well, a daddy server and a mommy server love each other very much, and you get logs. Bad joke. But I am glad that you asked. So just about everything can and does produce logs. And this is a comprehensive, non-comprehensive list of a bunch of different things that do produce logs and how we can use it. So obviously, going back to the initial story, firewalls. They are a great source of everything that's going in and out of your network. And the logs for that are a great tool for troubleshooting problems because inevitably everything is always a firewall problem. I was a firewall admin for years, so I know this. It was always my fault. Half of my job was fixing firewall problems, and the other half of my job was demonstrating that it wasn't a firewall problem. So that's pretty much how firewall logs are useful for that. But from a security perspective, they're a lot more than that. Because we're not necessarily just caring about what's working and what's not working. We're caring about what's getting in, what's trying to get in, that isn't getting in. Also what's getting out, or what's trying to get out and either getting out or not getting out. So those blocks and accepts and where things are going and who's talking to who, just if you're not going to get any data at all to use for trying to figure out what's happening, a firewall is definitely the first place I would look. That said, it's not just the only source. You look at things like your network devices. They generate all kinds of different logging information. Your routers can tell you things from, is someone trying who's not authorized to log in? Are there changes that were made to the configuration? Was something with our BGP changed where we're now going out a different routing path that we didn't expect? So maybe, something works differently on one ISP versus another. Like we were fighting with an ISP that was doing some transparent proxying that just was causing different IDS alerts to happen. So logging how the traffic was flowing was useful for that. Even simple network devices like switches. I've seen use cases for clients wanting to know what switch ports are being used and when, so that you can tell, hey, there's this many desks that are being utilized in our office and we're paying for space effectively. Wireless is also a great example of that, where you can really see where people are in the building based on what access point they're associated with. Are there rogue devices that are trying to authenticate to your network that aren't allowed? Also, is there, sources of interference that are causing a poor user experience? Like, is the microwave located right next to the access point? And, every time lunch rolls around, there's connectivity issues as a result of that. All those sorts of things can be generated and brought together into a central logging platform in order to really pinpoint those different types of issues. Also, some wireless devices do a lot more than just wireless. They tie into radius, and you can get a user associated with where they are. So you already have a lot of information about the people in your organization just purely from the wireless perspective. And you're not even looking at it, what they're logging into on the rest of the network or what they're trying to send in and outbound through your firewall. Applications and services. This really depends. Some applications are awesome at logging. They generate logs in a sane format that tell you what's happening, and it's consistent. Some logs in applications, like the applications that generate those logs, are written by absolute morons. And they're in a complete, utter format that makes no sense, and it changes every time. So who here writes software or anything like that? Okay, so you do. So please, when you're writing anything that generates a log file, please put it in the same format. And we'll love you forever on the log analyst side. So, yeah. So, all I ask is whatever we can do to make it easier, to be understandable. Like, there are programs, and I can think of a couple, that you need to download a third-party application in order to understand the log format. And that's just atrocious. But at least you're logging something. It's better than an application that just does things without having any way of auditing or tracking it. Most enterprise applications, fortunately, do log things. Access control systems, that can tie into all kinds of different things that, your swipe card, when you buzz into the building, you have a location and a person. So like, since I do some management, I'm responsible for making sure people show up and do their job. So like, we can easily tell, someone buzzes in the building, they're actually pretending to work, as opposed to if they don't buzz into the building, they're not there. So that's just a quick way to use that data. But you can also use it to say hey, someone buzzed in the building and then they get on the network, or did someone not buzz in the building that's on the network? Maybe we have someone who's using a stolen or compromised user account. Phone systems, a lot of times, from a security perspective, we're seeing social engineering as being a very, very common attack vector, where you'll get a phone call as opposed to trying to send an email or something to get into your network. So you'll call up the salesperson and say, hey, salesperson, I want to buy a lot of stuff. So I need you to go to this website and click on this link, and then there's going to be this file that you're going to download that's going to allow you to view that contract that you're going to sign. And salespeople do everything because they think that they're going to be able to sell something. So just that social engineering, you could use your phone system logs to see maybe is there this number that's always calling, or to try to identify, people that might be our salespeople. You never really know, but the way a lot of big phone systems work is you can just dial any number and it'll ring someone's desk, and it's a great way to use an attack vector because, they're not going to necessarily know, if someone turns them down, they just call another number and they're, going to be more than likely able to find another person who might be able to help them as well. Email systems, this comes down to a interesting how much data do we want to capture versus how much privacy do we want to maintain. A lot of times we look at this from a metadata perspective, what email addresses are sending what emails to what destinations, what subject lines are being used, are there any things in the email that are commonly associated with malware, that kind of thing. As opposed to necessarily logging the entire contents of the email, because people get all nervous when you start doing that. And depending on what's transmitted in email, it can be a concern. That said, a lot of those things that people would be concerned about probably shouldn't be in email anyway, but they end up there. Antivirus software, I know it gets a bad rap, but the logs of systems, having antivirus cleaning activities being performed, or the logs of these systems where it failed and some administrator has to actually do something about that, that can be very useful, especially when you combine your antivirus software saying, hey, I can't clean something up, with your firewall, or we'll get to your IDS saying, hey, now that this computer that I couldn't do anything about on the antivirus side is now sending all this information to China, that's probably bad. So those sorts of things, looking at logs from more than one source. IDS and IPS, like I kind of touched on, everything that's malware, more or less these days, has to talk out to something else because it's going to be centrally controlled. So an IDS a lot of times will catch that, but if you're not looking into your HTTPS, for example, you might not be able to see what's in the contents of encrypted communication. And it's not all that common to break that as well. So you could see your firewall communicating out to a known bad IP address. That's an easy way to tell. But, you might not necessarily be able to capture everything depending on where that traffic is sourced from. So, IDS are going to generate logs. Antivirus might generate logs for the initial compromise. You might have an email record of some potentially malicious email or some sender that's known as being a problem. It really all depends, but the different sources of information are all there. It's how you collect all that together and how you use it to solve the question of what's going on in my environment. So the key takeaway is almost anything does or can generate logs. And you can do a lot of interesting things with the logs. But the challenge is having the logs and making sure you can do something with them when you need it. Now, I would strongly say that a common question that I get from clients is, okay, so we had this security event that happened last week. Can you get me the logs for that? And if we don't have them, we can't. I would say we would be the richest company in the world if we could come up with a way to retroactively generate logs for security events. However, that's not possible. But if any of you want to come up with that as a business idea, that is billions of dollars, I can assure you. But it might not be ethical, so we probably should pass on that. But really, to dig into logs are machine data. It's boring, as we talked about. And we kind of made the Windows joke about admins not knowing they exist. A lot of people are shocked with the information that is available in their logs when they look at it. So this is an example of a really boring log file that I pulled off of one of my systems. It's basically saying, blah, 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 NTP, 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 and then some other stuff. We'll get to that in more detail. So what are these trying to tell me? So we're going to break down this example, but really, fundamentally, a log file is a play-by-play event of everything that's going on from this perspective of the device generating the logs. It doesn't necessarily tell you what's happening anywhere else because you're not necessarily telling that system to talk to other systems. A lot of times, like on this example, a regular Linux system, it's just going to be like what's going on in that system on its own. It doesn't care what the firewall is doing. It doesn't care what the server next to it is doing. It doesn't care what the other users are doing. It doesn't even care who's logging in to anything else other than itself. But when you look at that from the perspective of that server and a big picture, you can get a pretty good idea of your entire environment. So let's break down this log file real quick. We see a bunch of NTP synchronization. That's just normal behavior. We see a failure, which may or may not be a normal behavior. In the case of something like pool.ntp.org, there could have been a random server that's offline, so that might not be weird. But as we keep on going, we see, oh, there's an accepted password for root. So by itself, this means nothing. Because otherwise, someone logged in as root. That could be normal. It could be an administrator who's just logging in as root. This could be a company that uses root for everything. Not saying that's a good idea by any means, but it might be normal for this organization. That said, you could have a situation where maybe, hey, we knocked off something offline that would prevent NTP from working or your entire internet connection from working where you can't call out. Get everyone to be freaked out about, hey, the internet's down, and then log into this important server as root and then do something. So this by itself doesn't necessarily paint the whole picture. And like I said, why you should care, you can't go back in time. So if you don't have the logs archived in a way that you can reference them later, you're going to have problems. And yes, we can't retroactively make logs exist. So back to the stories. So we were talking previously about the denial of service attack that was caused by me doing a firewall upgrade. Well, hate to break it to you, that's not how it works, as much as, they wanted me to think. So what actually did happen in this case? So what we observed as we were looking at this behavior is this was not necessarily a distributed denial of service attack. Yes, there was a large number of requests that were being destined to this website, but the IP addresses that were sending this traffic were a very small number, about 5 to 10, which when I hear distributed denial of service attack, I assume that there's, more than 10 clients, because that's the point of a denial of service attack. So in the case of this, the 5 or 10 IP addresses we did some research on. There's a great tool for researching things like IP addresses. It's called Google. I'd recommend you check it out sometime. But by running these IP addresses through there, we were able to basically see the common factor across the board is that they were part of a denial of service attack mitigation platform. So what actually happened in this case is the company that thought they were being DOSed was actually participating in a denial of service attack because of how basically the internet protocols work. So as opposed to them actually being attacked, these IP addresses were actually trying to get them to stop sending traffic to the whatever factor was being attacked in this denial of service attack. What actually was happening is, since they had a public-facing website that was relatively well-known, clients were sending traffic to their website with a spoof source address, and the return traffic was being sent out to this destination for this denial of service attack. So they were using a bunch of different websites across the internet to basically send a bunch of port 80 return traffic to some poor person on the internet. And, obviously HTTP is not necessarily the best mechanism to do that. DNS is more popular for that. But anything that you can spoof a source address on can be used for denial of service attack, and this was just a case of using HTTP for that. And unfortunately for the client, there wasn't much that they could do about it because their website was existing. But we were able to easily break this down by showing, these are the top sources in the logs. This is the data on these IP addresses. This is when this event started. You can see normal behavior after your firewall upgrade for, 24, 48 hours before anything happened like this. And this is when this event started. So it was a great way to use the logs from the firewall to explain this is exactly what's happening and why. There's all kinds of other cool things that can be done with logging. DNS is an awesome source of information. When you look at everything that happens in a network is pretty much done by DNS, especially when we talk about ransomware, when we talk about malware. There's all the domain generation algorithms, and just by watching what domains are generated in your, or not generated, but used in your environment, you can get a lot of an idea of what things might be interesting behavior or potential cases for something bad happening. So in a normal environment, you would expect to see DNS requests for, a lot of different sites, like Google, Facebook, CNN, all of those types of sites are normal. However, when you start looking at requests that are happening either very rarely, like there's only one, and the domain was generated, an hour ago, it's probably not the coolest news site on the internet. I actually kind of ran into a case of a false positive of this, but it illustrates the point nicely. When the iPhone 7 came out, there was a site that was offering the iPhone 7 upgrade kit for your iPhone 6. It was basically a plug that you would stick in the headphone jack, and it would make it look like an iPhone 7. But that was a new site that showed up in DNS, a couple days after the iPhone 7 was announced, and we saw, an increase in a lot of users going to this new DNS domain. That, what the heck is this? And a lot of times it was flagged as a potentially harmful site because of that. That's a case where it wasn't a malicious site, it wasn't used for anything nefarious, but it was a case where, a lot of users were going to something that was a new domain. All too often, that's often something that's used for command and control or something that is associated with malware. Another case where we look at logs where they can be useful is employee behavior analysis, where we maybe can determine employees that might be exfiltrating information or potentially leaving. A good example that I like to say for this is, let's just say someone is looking to leave the company, especially like, let's say in their sales or engineering. A lot of times they're going to want to have the stuff that they worked on or their sales contacts so that they can continue to have that information after they're gone. Obviously, from an intellectual property perspective, that's a big problem. So to illustrate this example, let's hypothetically think that there's someone who's looking to send away information. I'm just going to name him Snowden for the case of this example. No relation, of course. But let's just say this character named Snowden is looking to exfiltrate a lot of sensitive information from a secure network and wants to share it with the population. Now, probably it's going to take a little bit of time to get all this information sent. There's probably going to be an abnormal amount of traffic that's sent from this user's machine. It's probably not all stored on one server inside, let's just say it's the government. My thought would be that the government has more than one file server where they keep all their sensitive information that people have to log into, just hypothetically. So if someone's looking to do this, you suddenly would probably have a case where there is a user who is authenticating into an abnormally high number of systems for what their normal usage pattern is. You also might see an abnormally high amount of data being transmitted from the system according to your firewall logs or according to any of your cloud services storage, because often this is going to be sent to either some random server or some cloud service. So if you're monitoring this and you have an idea of what the baseline for being normal is, you can look for patterns and abnormalities and potentially identify something like this as it's happening, shortly afterwards, or some combination before, you know, it ends up popping up on national news, which of course is bad. And really, I would say that a lot of the visibility that we talk to really comes down to what logs you have, what information that you collect, and how much you're thinking about what potentially could happen before it happens, which is very difficult. And a lot of times we run into cases where we talk to clients where they're like, hey, you know, it'd be really cool if we could see this sort of thing, and it just turns out that, you know, the client doesn't necessarily consider or even recognize some of the sources that could be very useful from a security perspective. And it's a challenge for me when I'm working with a client to architect a logging solution to really understand like everything that exists in an environment and how it can be used from a security perspective. Because it's really easy where, you know, a client doesn't consider it and I don't know it's there. And all too often it's like, that's the piece that we need when it comes to solving a problem later. So if anything, I would really encourage you to consider all the different sources of information that exist and what you could potentially do to, you know, solve this problem of not having information when you need it. Probably the most useful source of information if I'm looking to do some sort of security analysis, there's a number of them. Firewall logs are definitely a key one. DNS logs are really important. Authentication logs, who's logging into what and where. Email logs can be useful. A lot of times they're a little bit lower on the priority list. But in total, there's about 8 sources that we really look for when we're trying to get as big of a picture as we can when we're trying to design a security solution. And then the other challenge is once you get all these logs, what you do with them. Because from a human perspective, it's a challenge. Because we look at, you know, the volume of data on just a single server, no human is going to be able to deal with that. No human is going to be able to stay awake reading through a log file. So we look at just the sheer volume of how big an organization is. That's where the automated tools come in to basically make a human look at something when it's important. A lot of times we see when a customer is like, hey, I had an MSSP and they sent me, 1,200 alerts a day. I'm like, great, how many of those did you actually read? And they'll be like, yeah, we didn't look at any of them. Then what's the point? So all too often, we have so many things that are challenging our attention as IT professionals. And when you get a call from someone or when you get an alert that you have to take action on, you want it to matter. Let the tools go ahead and handle all of the processing and analysis that, doesn't require human intervention. And really make it so that whatever you end up doing, when something gets to the point where it comes to your attention, make it so that it's something that you care about and you have to take action on. Because otherwise, we're just never going to be able to get any sleep. And we're going to become basically immune to something happening. So if we're always getting alerts about this one thing happening, let's just say it's login based and it's normal that you get 500 of these per day. How are you going to find the 501th one, which is actually the problem? It's just not going to happen. So I really say that we're getting at the point where everyone's like, oh, we can generate alerts for everything. And that's such a problem that we can face as an industry where, you look at, let's just say that there was a company that had malware on their credit card readers that right around Christmas time that resulted in, everyone's credit card in America basically being stolen. They might have had a logo with a bullseye. A case like that where, yes, the tools actually picked up on that. Yes, their SOC was alerted to that happening. But it was one of those things that just no one thought to take action on this being a problem because they were so used to seeing these sorts of things. So it's a challenge that we face where we don't want to become immune to there being problems. And inevitably, I can see that happening. Exactly. Yeah. So like I say, if everything's urgent, nothing is urgent because you just can't prioritize. So that's really a challenge. And if you take anything away from that, understand that alert volume doesn't necessarily translate to alert usefulness or total security posture. And I'm probably preaching to the choir, as most of you I can imagine are in the receiving part of those alerts. And I can't necessarily convince, your management that, I'm right. But, maybe it's something that can help encourage, us all to be better at this and encourage us all to, end up in a place where we're working to create better security for our companies, but we're also not making it to the point where, we're missing things that we should. Because quite frankly, when we miss something as a industry, people are saying, what's happening? Why are we spending money on this technology and why isn't it catching everything? Because, we're spending too much time worrying about things that don't actually matter. And it's really hard to identify that. So the takeaway I really want to encourage you to do is to know, understand, and manage your logs. Know what data sources you have. Know which ones are going to be useful. Know which ones that maybe you don't keep track of that you could need in the future. And really try to understand what they mean. Either if this is through automated tools that help you, either this is a centralized platform for managing them, but know that, what the logs do, how they can be used, and be ready so that when something does come up, you're prepared to act. And have those logs in a way that's centrally managed so that they're preserved for when you need them. And make sure that you aren't trying to retroactively create logs that don't exist when you're in a situation that's necessary. There's plenty of ways to do that. You can spend as little or as much as you want to collect and store your logs. It really comes down to, what compliance tells you to do. It comes down to what you need from a security perspective. But, even centralizing your syslog, for example, on a syslog server and archiving that to the cloud, that can be a perfectly valid way to make sure that you have the logs in case you need them. It's not going to be fun if you need to look through it later, but it's completely usable and possible. So then finally, how to help us? Well, know your role from a security perspective, but also know how logs can be used to help the business. Because with the exception of places like security vendors, your company is not in business to do security. Unfortunately, as much as we'd like to think that IT is the end-all be-all, they're not. We are there to serve the company And we often end up costing the company money and not actually making it any money. So that's a challenge that we face. So how do we make sure that, we're doing a logging project, for example, how do we make sure that the business understands without saying like, oh, there's this security thing that we should invest in because it's important? Because that's difficult to do. So there's many opportunities for this. We look at some of those different log sources that I have. There are plenty of ways that can be used to help with business processes as well. Anything from, hey, your web server logs can tell you what your peak times of days are. If you're logging e-commerce transactions, you can get a sense of, are there customers that are having an error with the site that's preventing them from completing the checkout process? Are there products that are popular than others that are accessed a certain way? So is there a form of marketing, for example, that's being very effective for driving customers to our site? Things like, are customers getting to a certain point in the checkout process and giving up for some reason? Is it due to, like, maybe there's a poorly designed CAPTCHA, for example, or something along the lines of that where, we need to tweak this part in order to prevent us from losing business. From the phone logs, for example, we can look at call center data. Are there customers that are, purchasing a product and then ending up calling in for support? Is there something, a common thing that comes up with this product that, maybe we either need to redesign or we need to look at how we present this information, how we prevent this from happening? Because ultimately something like that is costing us money by customers calling in and asking for support. So yes, we can look at, our information security or our IT box as just this, hey, we need this security project and logs help us with this. But really, when you're looking at big picture, security can be more than just, our own world. We can look beyond that. And as they said in the keynote, it's important for us to not be the department of no. That all too often IT or security has the reputation of being no, can't do that, no. But really, they're going to do it anyway if we say no, especially with cloud technologies and the ability for anyone to just spin up a service. If IT doesn't want to host in their data center, the next thing you know, you're going to have 5 cloud providers that are all going to be doing the same thing that IT said you couldn't do. So we got to look at it from the perspective of, how do we enable business to function without getting in the way of it? And how do we ensure that, everything that's done is reasonably secure, and we try to manage the risk associated with that. And as I say that, I'm thinking, the one thing that I'm getting in the way is you and lunch. So I don't want to do that. So at that point, I think we're good to open up this presentation to any questions that you might have. Okay, so the question is when we're working with clients, how do we make sure that we reach the happy medium from not alerting too much or alerting too much, essentially? Too little or too much. So a lot of it comes down to what is normal in an environment. So, and also it comes down to what sorts of things are critical and what sorts of things are business impacting. So a lot of things can be, we would actually start by looking at, all the alerts as a big picture. So we consider that a tuning phase, where we say like, we get 50,000 alerts a day when we first turn something like this on. And where do we, what alerts are you going to need to do action on? What alerts are basically noise? What alerts are false positives and that sort of thing? And we look at that over an extended period of time. Exactly, yeah. So if we know, for example, that, obviously, this is a bad example, but let's just say that there's, a service account that fails logging in 50,000 times. That's not necessarily something that you want to say is normal. It means that there's something that needs to be updated and you need to find that problem, which a lot of the times is the best way to attack something like that, so that you don't get to the point where you're ignoring an alert or you're whitelisting out something that's bad. You fix the problem that causes the bad thing. Not always possible. But that's a good source of reducing alert volume. Because all too often I can see cases where someone wouldn't solve the problem for that, or they wouldn't identify that. They'd just be like, oh, it's normal to see, login failure attempts on our daily report. And that's worthless because, someone fails to log in, 1,000 times, 51,000, like, oh, it was just a day that, there's an extra hour in the day or something like that. Daylight savings time, whatever. But it was like, in July, so the connection didn't happen. But something like that where you fix the problems that are causing a lot of the noise, but then you also look at, I always look at IDS signatures, for example. Let's just say that you have an IDS signature for, a vulnerability in Server 2003 or XP, and all of your systems are Windows 7 or above. You don't care if, there's a vulnerability to, XP that someone tries to exploit on your network because you just don't have it. Of course, you have to have the network inventory to know what's on your network in order for that to be effective. So it really comes down to, we have to understand that the client knows their environment. We have to leverage that, but we have to be intelligent about how we're alerting on things so that when something is actually a problem, we know to send them an alert on that. So hopefully that answered your question. Cool. Yeah. Yeah, so the question on that was basically when you look at a Windows system, by default, the security policy is not necessarily best set up from a logging perspective. And he's looking for suggestions on how to, best practices for making sure that's enabled. I would say that there's a number of guides for that. I think the NIST has some good standards for what logging should be enabled on a Windows system for that. There are also like a list of Windows event IDs that we normally don't find benefit from. I don't know all them off the top of my head, but for example, like a common example I would say is like Windows Firewall. A lot of places turn that off for whatever reason. I'm not going to say that's a good idea or not, but what happens in a Windows environment is even if Windows Firewall is disabled, it's going to generate a security event for everything that's accepted. I think it's 5156 to 5158. So that range, if you know that your Windows security or Windows Firewall logs are worthless because they're accepting everything, that's something you can easily never collect in a SIM because you just don't care. So that's one of the challenges for that. So it is really environment specific, but there are a general list that I don't necessarily can say it's written down any specific spot where I can point to it, but if you grab my contact information afterwards, I can send you, what we normally go with as a blacklist and a whitelist for that. You're welcome. Yeah, the Ultimate Windows Security has a great human explanation of what those are. And another thing to say, some SIMs, and this is when I will say Splunk, they do collect logs based on a volume of data per day. Some are events. But for something that's based on how big your log volume is, every Windows event has the description that says, hey, this is a Windows event and this is, stuff. That's always the same, so there's no point in logging that and indexing it because it's just going to use a license. So a lot of that makes sense to just, cut off the top. Yep. Yeah, that sounds right. It just, since it's such a big industry, everyone's got their standards for that. But I would say that, just put them all together and see what the consistencies are and, make a decision based on what makes sense in your environment. Yeah. That's a good question. Log sources that added a lot more value. I would say that the one that is the least common and the one that we have to kind of push on the most is actually DNS, because you know, us being security people, we understand the value of DNS, but a lot of times people just don't see that. And it can be a challenge to collect just because of the volume that's associated with it. But from the bang for your buck sort of thing, if you're looking to know, you know, what's happening on your network, and you don't have great like proxy logging or just don't have a proxy, you can do a lot of the same things with just knowing what DNS requests are made, just because it's such a fundamental aspect of the internet. So I would say that's probably if we don't have anything, you know, like firewall logs obviously are almost like everyone can understand that, but DNS is one of the ones that we have to push for a lot, and it's hugely useful from a security perspective. I could talk for an hour about DNS, but I figure you guys would hate me. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.